All right, make sure you get any homework turned in. Today we're going to look at topic 8.7, America as a world power. 8.7 is explain the various military and diplomatic responses to international developments over time. So we're really going to look at the Cold War tensions between the Soviets and the United States during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and look at the ebbs and flows of tensions and reduced tensions between the East, the Soviet Union, and the West, the United States. So Eisenhower is the famous general from World War II. He is the president. He has concerns about the United States military industrial complex bankrupting the United States, but he also doesn't want to look weak and be perceived as weak to the Soviets. So he's got a hard dilemma to go through. So let's look at Eisenhower's foreign policy. And Eisenhower, along with his Secretary of State, John Dulles, want to continue the idea of containment set up by Truman, but they're going to put a little spin on it. John Dulles says, you know what, we got to have a break of war. We've got to improve our offense because the best defense is a strong offense. So Eisenhower, worried that defense spending would bankrupt the nation, came up with a brand new policy with Dulles that says, you know what, we are going to rely more on the Air Force and the nuclear weapons than traditional ground forces. So Dulles announces a policy of massive retaliation, or MAD. Okay, basically we are going to use the nuclear weapons not as a first strike, not as an attack system, but if we are attacked, we're going to go ahead and be able to use nuclear weapons. But on the flip side, massive retaliation meant that the United States would consider the use of nuclear weapons to halt any aggression if it believed the United States was threatened. So Dulles further states that the nation must be ready to go to the brink of war, all the way up to the brink of war, the line of war, in order to maintain world peace. We won't cross that line, but we will go all the way up to the line. This policy of brinkmanship would greatly increase the tensions during the 50s and 60s, as we will see with the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Cuban Missile Crisis that Kennedy deals with in the 1960s. So this going all the way up to the line but not crossing, is going to lead the East and the West, the Soviets and the United States, to have an arms race of stockpiling weapons, and the arms race is going to lead to a space race. So let's look at the arms race. Yes, the United States used 2 atomic weapons in August of 1945 to end World War II against Japan, and the use of those nuclear weapons led to discussions about the morality of nuclear warfare. Should we use such a terrible weapon in war? Some people said yes, because it ultimately saves American lives. Others believe no, because it's far more destructive. So by 1945, with the help of 2 U.S. citizens, the Rosenbergs, the Soviets showed that they had developed an atomic bomb. The Rosenbergs were tried for espionage or spying against the United States and were ultimately sentenced to death in New York. So when the Soviets launched their own and tested their own atomic bomb, thus began the nuclear arms race. So the two nations began to stockpile nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons. And what I want to remind you of, during the Truman Doctrine and a little bit, not quite much, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine was going to say, we are going to do everything that we can to contain communism and prevent the spread of communism, while the Marshall Plan was providing economic aid to countries that remain democratic. So remember, under the Truman Doctrine, Greece and Turkey did not want to have communism, so we put non-nuclear weapons in those countries aimed at the Soviets. So the United States in 1952 detonated the version 2 atomic weapon known as a hydrogen bomb, and the Soviet Union detonated one a year later in 1953, coinciding, incidentally, with the end of the Korean conflict. Both nations rushed to develop this version 2 of the nuclear missile and again continued the stockpiling. So the tensions are increasing. The Cold War threatened to explode into a traditional war, a hot war, because of the stockpiling of weapons. And if you recall, the ingredients for war are militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. So right now we definitely have the ingredient of militarism. We see the nationalism, the pride. So we can see why the Cold War would possibly explode into a hot war. So in response, in 1953, Eisenhower announced the Atoms for Peace plan at the United States, or United Nations. And the Atoms for Peace plan was a plan that the United Nations would supervise and search for peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Now, we need to realize that the Soviets are a permanent member of the Security Council. And in any one of the 5 permanent members, the Soviets, the Chinese, the French, the United Kingdom, or the United States, veto the plan, any plan resolution, that plan or resolution is ultimately vetoed and will not pass. And the Soviets didn't want to appear weak, so the Soviets refused to participate in the Eisenhower plan for looking at United Nations supervision for better nuclear technology. Thus, it never moves forward. So America's hearing the response by the Soviets, invests large sums of money, both private and public. So citizens as well as governments invested money in fallout shelters designed to withstand a nuclear attack in homes, schools, public buildings. And if you look at older buildings around the United States, there might be a couple in Beaufort, I'm not sure, of a yellow sign that has a black circle on it with 3 yellow triangles. That is the fallout shelters. That's where you could go to protect yourself against a nuclear attack. Moreover, in 1957, the Soviets launched the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth, known as Sputnik. And as I said and alluded to, the arms race is going to lead to the space race. So the arms race then becomes a space race with the goal of putting a person on the moon, and the United States rushes to catch up by launching its own artificial satellite. So what's the relationship, and how did the relationship between the East and West change? So in context, we got to go all the way back to Lenin. Lenin changes Russia into a communist leader with the Brest-Litovsk treaty, which overthrew the Tsar. He lasts. Then his predecessor is Stalin. Stalin comes to power in 1920, and in 1953, Stalin dies. Okay, so there's been an ups and downs between the tensions of the Soviets and the United States, and tensions between the Soviets and the Soviets rose and fell during his time in office. Again, Stalin it dies in 1953, and in replacement, Nikolai Khrushchev takes over. And for a short period of time, Khrushchev actually kind of takes a step back and the tensions between the East and West fall a little bit because the Soviets are starting to have to deal with some internal strife, namely Hungary, Poland, because going all the way back to the three major conferences at the end of World War II, we had Tehran, we had Yalta, and we had Potsdam. At Yalta, Stalin promised to have free and open elections within a year, even though he had no desire to do that the Eastern Bloc countries could decide and have open and free elections whether they wanted to be communist or democratic. So some 20 years later, Hungary's like, where are my free and open elections? And a group of citizens, dissidents, start to revolt. And this occurs in November of 56. Relationships between the Soviets and the West will sour because of the Soviets' response to the Hungarian Revolution. Hungarian dissidents that wanted their open and free elections have an uprising in November to demand democratic reforms. And by the end of the month, Soviet tanks and troops go into Budapest. They squash the revolt, basically jail any pro-democratic leaders, and they restore their own pro-Soviet regime in Budapest and Hungary, and the revolt is squashed. The West is upset that they weren't able to have free and open elections, and tensions increase. And then the next major thing that is going to rise tensions between the East and the West is the U-2 spy plane incident. So in 1958, Khrushchev renews its demands by Stalin that NATO powers get out of West Berlin. So the French, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Eisenhower and its allies predictably refused. Khrushchev suggested that he and Eisenhower discuss the issue and meet in Paris in 1960, and then later on possibly in the Soviet Union. The Eisenhower accepts. He's polite about it. There's really no one's really sure whether or not Eisenhower was going to really want to give up Western Berlin, but allow the French and the English still to control Western Berlin. Again, he wants to ease the tensions, but he doesn't want to look weak. So there's that dilemma that he's got. Khrushchev's 1959 visit to America produced a cool but polite public response. Tanks proceeded for a further conference in Moscow. But shortly before the Paris meeting, the U.S. launched a spy plane from the spy organization, the CIA, to take photographs of the Soviet Union, and was shot down. Now, the U-2 spy plane was supposedly able to fly higher than any Russian plane or missile. So it's supposedly a plane that could not be shot down. Well, it was shot down, and its pilot, Gary Powers, was captured. Khrushchev lashed out angrily against the United States for spying on the Soviets, rightfully so, and basically said, we are not going to meet in Paris. Then the meeting in the Soviet Union in Moscow is withdrawn. So the United States was able to maintain a presence in West Berlin. Thus, after 8 years in office, Eisenhower's term as president is done. He failed to eliminate tensions between the Soviets and the United States, and in some respect, because of the U-2 spy plane incident, tensions actually increased. So let's look at Cuba. Now, what we need to understand with Cuba is that this goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which was a warning to Europe not to colonize in Latin America, and we would not colonize in Asia or Africa, and that the Latin America would be under our control. It would be our sphere of influence. In 1956, Fidel Castro began a communist revolt against the pro-democratic, pro-capitalist President Batista. And if you recall, the Communist Manifesto and the communist regimes basically are redistribution of wealth amongst the people. They hate the wealthy elites. So when the revolt ended, went to Castro's victory in 1959, the United States quickly recognized the new government in order to maintain the sphere of influence, but it was uneasy. Castro, however, soon adopted policies that angered the Eisenhower administration. There were human rights violations. He imprisoned political prisoners, people that supported the Batista government. So again, soon after, the relationships between Cuba and the United States soured. He also nationalized key industries and turned towards the Soviets for aid. He modeled the nationalization of industries after the Soviets' 5-year plan, after Mao's Great Leap Forward. And so Cuba was coming into a communist nation extremely close, 90 miles from Florida, less than 100 miles. So how is the United States military going to respond? So in the farewell address, Eisenhower spoke out against the negative impact of the Cold War on the U.S. society. He warned against the nation becoming too militarized. He likened the militarization of the United States Empire to the Roman Empire, and because the Roman Empire became too militaristic, the Roman Empire fell. So if the outgoing president was right, the arms race was taking on its momentum and logic of its own, the stockpiling. So it seemed that the Americans in the 60s, that the United States was in danger of going down the same path as the Roman. So in comes Kennedy. The election between the Republican candidate Richard Nixon and the Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. Nixon, being significantly older than Kennedy, is going to play an important reason why Kennedy is going to win the election. The Kennedy-Nixon election is the first time that a television is going to televise the presidential debate, and Nixon, who thought it was unmanly to wear makeup, didn't really understand the requirements and how television worked. JFK, younger, more vibrant, understood the success of the television and understood how it worked, will lead to JFK becoming the president. So JFK renews the space program. He realized that we were falling behind in the Soviets. And then by 1960, Eisenhower, the Republican, had completed his terms. John F. Kennedy wins the election in a very close race against Nixon. And at his inaugurational speech, he renews his intent to support the winning of the space race. And again, the goal of the space race was to put a man on the moon. And in the inauguration speech, he basically says, by the end of the decade, by 1970, we will have a man on the moon. That's our goal. And NASA, who is in charge of the space program, is able to do it in July of 1969, with the Neil Armstrong taking the first steps of any human on the moon. So John Glenn becomes the first United States citizen to orbit the Earth. The very first human to orbit the Earth was a Soviet cosmonaut or astronaut by the name of Yuri Gagarin. And in 1969, 6 years after Kennedy's death, Armstrong utters the famous words, "That was one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," and is the first person on the moon. The United States win the space race at a cost of approximately $25.4 billion. So let's circle back to how Kennedy responds to the Cuban situation and look at the failed Bay of Pigs attempt that will lead to the Cubans and Fidel Castro becoming closer allies with the Soviets, which will lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So again, going back to the Monroe Doctrine, Latin America is our sphere of influence. Europe, Asians stay away. So the United States had been deeply involved in Latin American affairs since its early history. Latin American nations were often resented such interventions in U.S. policies, sometimes left a legacy between Latin America and the United States of anger and hostility. So we got to go back to the three major presidents that dealt with Latin American involvement. We had Teddy Roosevelt, use of the military, carry a big stick. We are going to force the Latin American countries to do what we want, and if they don't do what we want, we're going to use our military. We had, next president was Howard Taft. President Taft was going to give money to companies in Europe, or excuse me, in Latin America to establish companies, and then would give those companies money to establish companies, and then those companies would sway their host country, and it resulted in what was known as banana republics. Okay, countries that we would use one major exports as its means of financial growth. And finally, we had Wilson with missionary or moral diplomacy, that we are going to support governments in Latin America that are pro-democratic. So again, we see the United States starting to bully Latin America in the early 1900s. So in 1960s, the United States had an uneasy relationship with most of the Latin American countries. While President Kennedy supported the Cold War policies of containment that Truman and Eisenhower had, it hoped to warm up and ease the tensions with the Latin American countries. So one of the policies that JFK does is the Alliance for Progress, which basically he pledges roughly $20 billion to the region to help stabilize it, to help it out, and to help stop the spread of communism. So kind of like a modern version of the dollar diplomacy set up by Taft. However, the funds went to aid repressive governments simply because they were anti-communist. So now Kennedy has put a spin on it, kind of more of a Wilsonian moral diplomacy spin on it. So Kennedy's alliance to progress was really a combination of Taft's dollar diplomacy and Wilson's moral diplomacy. So how does this affect Cuba? So after JFK takes office, he approves initially a plan set up by our spy organization, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to try and overthrow Castro. And the CIA plan was known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. And the plan called for Cuban exiles, people that had escaped Castro's imprisonment of political supporters, to Miami to return back to Cuba to help the dissidents and help the revolt of Cuban nationals against Castro. The United States CIA plan also included supplying U.S. military weapons, military material, and training to invade Cuba to overthrow Castro. And again, the invasion was to take place on April 17th, 1961, and a mere few hours prior to the invasion, Kennedy stops all of the support. And the Bay of Pigs invasion occurs. The political prisoners that left Cuba and ended up in Miami came and returned, expecting support. The people that wanted to overthrow Castro, that Cuban nationalists, did the attack. And ultimately, because the U.S. did not back the exiles or the nationals, the Bay of Pigs invasion is a complete disaster. And those people that tried to revolt against Castro were in prison, and it's a black eye in the United States. So no uprising support followed. Castro quickly crushed the invading forces and gave the United States and Kennedy's government a black eye. And because of the failed attempt that was supposed to be supported by the Americans, the Cubans ally themselves to and become better friends with the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union take advantage of this and start to produce and build weapon silos, nuclear weapon silos, and nuclear weapons bases in Cuba as a response to the Truman Doctrine of putting non-conventional weapons in Greece and Turkey. So fearing another U.S. invasion attempt, Castro agrees to a Soviet plan to build and base nuclear missiles inside Cuba. Now, Kennedy learns of the plan because after the Bay of Pigs invasion, U.S. warships and planes start to spy on Cuba and to see what's going on. And some photographs came back showing soccer fields in Cuba. Now, we need to realize soccer is not a popular sport in Cuba. Baseball is the main sport, but soccer is extremely popular in Europe and in the Soviet Union. So obviously, when we see soccer fields being built, we know that there is either European or Russian influences going on. So the United States will then send more advanced spy planes, and that's when we see the construction of nuclear missile silos in Cuba. So in response to these nuclear missile silos being built and the breakdown and the Soviets' attempt to ward off the Monroe Doctrine, Kennedy announces a naval blockade, or more importantly, and correctly called, a quarantine zone around Cuba. No Soviet ships will be able to cross a certain line around Cuba. Think of quarantine as if you are sick, you're separated from the rest of the people so you don't get sick. So Cuba was being separated from the Soviets. And the United States and Kennedy administration demanded that the Soviet missiles be withdrawn and take down the missile silos construction in Cuba. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the United States and the Soviets to the closest it's ever been to the brink of war, and ultimately the Soviets back down. They withdraw the missiles, they take down the missile silos, and a few months later, Kennedy promises to remove the non-conventional missiles from Turkey and Greece. Kennedy, who had a black eye for the Bay of Pigs invasion, clearly demonstrated that the U.S. would not tolerate Soviet presence in the Western Hemisphere, and by doing so, regained some of its prestige lost because of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. I would argue that we wouldn't have the black eye, we wouldn't lose the prestige if Kennedy hadn't stopped or the aid to the CIA funding. So in 1963, the Soviets, the United States, and Great Britain signed what was known as the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which all three nations agreed not to test nuclear weapons in space or in the air or underwater, but building caverns underground under the land was still an option. So underground testing would still be permitted. So Nixon is assassinated. LBJ has to deal with Vietnam and the Great Society that we'll talk about later. Let's look at the Nixon administration. Does he increase tensions or does he decrease tensions with the East? So we have Humphreys, we have Nixon, we have Wallace running for president in 1968. Nixon vows to end the war in Vietnam through a program called Vietnamization, getting rid of our troops out of there. Lyndon Johnson becomes president in 1963 when Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. Johnson is tired of the war, doesn't run for re-election in 1968, thus allowing Richard Nixon to become president because the United States is tired of the war. And as you can see, Nixon really wins in a landslide. So although Nixon's main foreign policy objective was to end the Vietnam War, more on this later, he had other foreign policies and interests as well. So the Nixon Doctrine. In 1969, Nixon announces to the world the Nixon Doctrine, in which the United States would no longer provide direct military assistance to Asia, thus basically the Vietnamization process. Even though the Vietnam War had not yet concluded, the president promised there would be no more Americans there and no more Vietnam. So we would not go to war unless there were strategic benefits to the war. So in turn, he develops a new policy towards China and the Soviets, one of détente, no tensions or easing of tensions. The United States had not had diplomatic relationships with China since 1949 when Mao Zedong overthrew the nationalists and China became communist. Under Nixon, the United States adopted a new foreign policy, and in 1971, Richard Nixon accepts an invitation to go and visit China, becoming the very first president to do so. And in February 1972, Nixon arrives in China and has meetings with Mao. The National Security Advisor, Henry Kissinger, also accompanies Nixon on the peace mission. And after more than 20 years of hostility, Nixon and China leaders Mao have an open diplomatic exchanges, and this is kind of known as ping pong debate. Now, if you recall, ping pong is very popular in China, and an homage from the movie Forrest Gump. Remember, Forrest Gump goes to China and plays ping pong a lot. This is kind of a reference to the easing of tensions between Mao and Nixon. The following policies toward China that was separated from the Soviet Union. Nixon underscored the split that had occurred in communism and ultimately leads to reduced tensions between the Soviets, or excuse me, between the Chinese and the United States. And this will lead to more detente, easing of tensions with the Soviets. So Nixon balances the openness and says, hey, so if we were able to ease tensions with Chinese, why don't we try and ease the tensions with you guys, the Soviets, as well? So thus, Nixon and Kissinger shaped a policy of détente. The goal of détente was to bring about the warming of the Cold War, thaw it out, have better relationships. Nixon's policy of détente was designed to prevent open conflict. During the Nixon administration, the foreign policy was shaped by a political philosophy favored by Kissinger and its power politics. Therefore, in its dealing with China and the Soviets, the United States made a decision based on what it needs to maintain the strength. So again, openness. And this is going to lead to the 1972 SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks, where we're going to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons. The SALT talks and agreement set limits on the number of defensive missile sites as well as strategic missiles each nation could have. So not only the number of missiles, but where they are shot from. President Nixon underscored his willingness to pursue détente and visited the Soviets in May of 72, thus also becoming the very first president to visit the Soviet Union after the Soviets became communist, with the exception of FDR and the Tehran Conference, even though Tehran isn't, or excuse me, the Yalta Conference, and even the Yalta Conference was designed about World War II. Yalta was technically part of the Crimea, which was part of the Soviets. He was the first president since World War II to make such a journey, as I just said. So Nixon's space program. Advances in the space program, the Nixon administration. In 1969, the American astronaut Neil Armstrong becomes the first person on the moon, so it continued what JFK wanted to do. And the triumph of seeing Armstrong plant the United States flag brought to an end the space race and was a bright spot in a otherwise troubled decade. Let's look at what happens between the Middle East and Africa, namely Israel and its surrounding Arab nations. So post-war decolonization and the emergence of nationalist movements in Africa and the Middle East led both the Soviets and the Americans to seek new allies in the region. And typically in the Middle East and in Africa, if one country went Soviets positive towards the east, its neighboring country was positive towards the west. American influence supported Israel right off the bat. Thus, a lot of the Arab nations around Israel were pro-Soviet. Among them were a series of crises in the Middle East because of the East-West conflict, in which the United States had been little involved in until Israel was officially created. And on May 14th, 1948, years after Zionist efforts, the United States promised the Zions and the Jews its independence, its nation of Israel, and Israel became an independent nation, thus upsetting the Palestinians, the Arabs that were living on the land, upset, which gathered support from the Arab nations around, and Truman immediately recognized Israel and supported Israel. But the creation of Israel, while resolving some conflicts, created others. In fact, the 6 neighboring Arab nations, to include Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, just to name a few, invaded Israel to liberate the Palestinians and give the Israeli states back to the Palestinians. Israel defeated these Arab invaders with the help of the United States military technology, and thus creates what is known as the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, under the guidance of Yasser Arafat. Was established in '64 with the goal of getting Israel controlled back to the Arab Palestinians and ending the Jewish presence. The organization used terrorist activities. We've talked in recent years. We saw the Gaza Strip and the Hamas war between the Hamas and the Israelis. Okay, one of the group's leader, Yasser Arafat, helped coordinate and direct guerrilla attacks against the Israelis. In 1967, after the win by the Israelis, the 6-day war with Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, again, its Arab nations, created what is known as the Khartoum Resolution. The resolution basically said that the state of Israel saying no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, no negotiation of it with it. So basically all the Arab nations said they're not going to recognize Israel. So in 1977, the Egyptian president Sadat would make a surprise visit with the Israeli Prime Minister Begin. And a year later, Jimmy Carter would host Sadat and Begin at the Camp David, the recreational retreat of the president, and all 3 countries would sign what is known as the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords between Sadat and Begin hammered out peace treaty terms. The 2 leaders agreed and signed in 1979. However, other Arab nations refused still to recognize it. Sadat was later assassinated in what we think is by pro-Arab countries that resented or did not support the recognition of Israel in order to replace a more devout Muslim that was anti-Israeli. It's not been confirmed. Another black eye for the United States under the Jimmy Carter administration was the Iran hostage crisis, in which the Iranians stormed our embassy, took our embassy workers hostage for 444 days, and they were released on January 20th, 1980, with the inauguration of President Reagan. So, kind of give you some background on this information, on this embassy attack. In 1979, a revolution led by an Islamic fundamentalist topped the pro-American Shah Pahlavi. The Shah suffered from terminal cancer, requested treatment in the United States. Carter agreed. Thus, the Islamic dissidents really did not like the fact that we were treating a pro-American leader of cancer. So when Pahlavi was in getting treatment, the pro or anti-American nationalists attacked our embassy, taking 50 American hostages, and the United States government tried to work with Iran to negotiate. But again, January 20th, 1980, nearly 444 days, the hostages were able to come home. So key takeaways from today's unit. We got to go back and look at the Monroe Doctrine. We got to look at TR's big stick diplomacy. We got to look at Taft's dollar diplomacy. We got to look at Wilson's moral diplomacy. The Cold War competition that was in Africa and Asia had extended into Latin America for country support between East and West. We also saw that Eisenhower was concerned about the large military complex that would lead to the downfall of the United States. The military complex increased, had large stocks of nuclear weapons. This nuclear arms race led to the space race. And finally, we look at how there was conflict between Israel and its Arab countries, sparking tensions in the region between the East and West. So make sure you've got homework done for tomorrow. Have a good day.